Welcome to the show. On today's episode, we have Chelli Pumphrey. She's a licensed psychotherapist, a global relationship expert, and the author of Insight It's 2020, How to Trust Yourself to Protect Yourself from Narcissistic Abuse and Toxic Relationships. With almost 30 years of clinical experience, Chelli has worked with a diverse group of clients and issues, but specializes in working with trauma, adult attachment, and narcissistic and pathological relationship abuse. She is a Reiki master and a certified integrated mental health provider, and is passionate about using a holistic, trauma-focused approach to helping clients access their innate ability to heal. In today's episode, we talk about narcissistic relationships, both romantic and in friendships. So this is a great episode. Please enjoy. Hi, Chelli. Thank you so much for being with us here today.
Thank you, Kat. I'm super excited. I love your podcast and all of the wonderful topics that you cover. It's really interesting.
So today we're going to be talking about one of my favorite topics, which is narcissists and toxic relationships. So before we begin, I want to know a little bit about your background and why you got into this topic.
Yeah, well, it began long ago in childhood, we'll say. I grew up in a home where I had a narcissistic step parent, and I think that was my first exposure to that, even though when I was young, I didn't know what narcissism even was. I just knew that this person seemed to be really mean and cruel and didn't like me very much. And as I became a therapist in my early 20s, and I've been a therapist for about 30 years now. And so I've always worked with domestic violence and narcissistic abuse just because I've been interested in it, and my career path had always taken me down that road. But on a personal note, I also found that I kept attracting one narcissistic partner after another. And I was just completely baffled. Like, how is it that I can be a therapist who should be able to spot this, who helps people all the time figure out how to leave these kinds of relationships or prevent them? Yet I kept finding myself in them. And despite all of the work I did, all of my quite an extensive healing journey, somehow I just kept finding myself in this pattern. So I was really determined to do a deep dive into it and figure out what was going on that made me so susceptible to it.
So can you define what narcissistic abuse is?
Sure. So, very specifically, narcissistic abuse would be if you're in a relationship with somebody who has narcissistic personality disorder. And that can look like, so somebody that's a narcissist, well, let me explain it this way. Narcissism, you can really think of on a spectrum. And to some degree, we all have a bit of, I don't like to say that we all have some narcissism in us, but we all can be egocentric and self-centered. And there's a healthy degree of that where we have to have boundaries. We have to have some pride and some good feelings about ourselves. But there's a normal realm of that. And then as you move along the spectrum closer to what we would be able to diagnose as narcissistic personality disorder, you move away from just being, liking yourself and feeling good about yourself to feeling superior to others or feeling entitled to things that maybe you shouldn't really be entitled to. Narcissists also seem to have a lack of empathy, and sometimes they can be very, very sensitive to criticism, even if you're not even criticizing them, but they perceive it as criticism. They also sometimes can think that they're above the law or think that things that apply to other people shouldn't apply to them, or they require special admiration or status, even though they haven't maybe earned it. So those are, some of the signs you might see in a narcissist. But narcissistic abuse in particular is when you have someone like that in the relationship, there's a lot of dynamics because of that personality that start to happen that can be very abusive. And it can be psychological abuse, emotional, verbal, physical, financial, sexual. I mean, there's a lot of different ways that a narcissist can abuse a partner. So I just want to pause for a minute and see if that feels clear before I maybe talk a little bit more about some of the dynamics of narcissistic abuse.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So with narcissistic abuse, one dynamic that tends to happen a lot is what we call gaslighting. And gaslighting is where the narcissist will turn things around on a partner to make them doubt themselves, to make them doubt their reality, or to even feel crazy. And this comes from the term gaslighting came from an old movie where the husband would go around, he like basically he wanted to steal his wife's inheritance, and he would go around the house and he would dim, like back in the old days it was gas lights, we'd have electrical lights, but he would dim the lights but not tell her, and then he would make her feel like she was crazy when she kept thinking, oh, the lights are dim, what's happening? So that's where the term came from, but it gives you that idea. It's this crazy making kind of thing where a great example is where, let's say, you're married to your husband and you notice texts to another woman on there that are clearly sexual or romantic in nature, and you question him about it, and he turns around and says, you didn't see anything, that's just my friend, I don't know what you're talking about, I tell all my friends I love them, and doubts the whole thing, makes you doubt it, or tells you you're jealous or you're insecure, and you leave the conversation feeling completely baffled and confused, and what did I do wrong, when really it was him that did something wrong. So that's an example of gaslighting. Some other things that happen with narcissistic abuse are, gosh, there's so many. There's a cycle that happens in these kinds of relationships. There's an acronym that was developed by this woman. Gosh, my brain is drawing a blank for her name right now. I think it was Jennifer Freud, but it's called DARVO. And what it stands for is deny, attack, reverse, victim, and offender. And what happens is, like, there's this aspect of gaslighting in here too, where let's say you say something to the narcissist and they deny that it ever happened. No, I didn't cheat on you. No, you didn't find any text messages. And then they turn it back on you and attack you. You're jealous. You're insecure. How dare you look at my phone? And then the reverse, victim and offender, is where instead of the person who is being cheated on being the victim, they skillfully turn it around and become the victim themselves. I can't believe you're always accusing me of cheating on me or cheating on you. I feel so abused. You're so abusive. I can't believe how you treat me. And all of a sudden you're like, oh my God, what happened? What did I do to this person? And that is one cycle that will happen again and again and again in the relationship. There's also a lot of criticizing, belittling. Narcissists can be very passive aggressive sometimes. They might make jokes to put you down and then act, oh, it's just a joke, I didn't mean that, don't be so sensitive. There's a lot of callous behavior, not caring about your feelings. Boy, I could go on and on about a lot of these things. So how's this sounding right now?
Good. So I wanted to ask you, because a lot of people, they might wonder, are they narcissists, as opposed to just being very confident, or maybe they're a control freak, or maybe they're just really into self-care and they're like, does that make me a narcissist? So how can you yourself might be more towards the narcissist side?
Yeah, it's such a good question because I hear that a lot. But there is a test online that you can go and take, and you can just Google I'm not going to share it on out here, but you can just Google narcissistic personality test, and you can take it and see it's actually pretty reliable. But I will say, Kat, that one thing that I hear is people who are being abused by a narcissist, it is so common for them to come and ask me, am I a narcissist? Maybe I'm the one. And what happens is, in these relationships, after they've been manipulated and gaslighted for so long, they start to doubt themselves. They start to feel selfish or crazy, or something is wrong with me. And usually, if you're the one that's in a lot of pain and you're like experiencing all of this, you're not the narcissist, but you maybe have been told that. Or you've been given this idea that you're somehow selfish if you want to take care of yourself, or if you're having feelings about this horrible behavior that you're living with.
And what are your thoughts on what social media has done, especially to the younger generation, where everything is me, me, look what I have, look what I'm doing. And I only want to hang out with people if you have this many followers, or you can make me look good. What do you think that's going to do to upcoming generations?
That's it. Such a great question. I just recently wrote a book and I was doing some research on this question. And there's some new research that's been done by a professor named Dr. Keith Campbell and Jean Twenge. And they've been looking at these trends in the newer generations. And what I found in my research is that there's actually no clear cut answer. They found an increase in self esteem rates in, I think they were looking at college students and, kind of that demographic. They found an increase, and I don't remember the exact number, but they definitely saw some trends that were going more toward more narcissism. Maybe people aren't necessarily diagnosable, but they were seeing an uprise in it. But there were some other research projects that went through and did some, larger scale studies and said some of this research is not statistically significant. So they're saying, no, there's really not a trend. So who knows what the truth is? I think over time, when we've had more years that have passed and more research, we'll probably start to see some more clear answers on that.
So you had mentioned that there's a specific type of maybe personality traits or maybe past traumas that would attract a narcissist. Can you get into a little bit more about that?
Yes, yes. I love this question because I think there's a lot of myths and misperceptions out there about why people get involved in relationships with narcissists. And one of the biggest myths is that people who are codependent get involved in abusive relationships. And that is a myth. There's a lot of truth to it. Yes, people who are codependent or have past trauma and have codependent behaviors can be very vulnerable to abusive relationships, and in particular, people with personality disorders like narcissists. However, there's been research done by a woman named Sandra Brown, and what she found is that the majority of, in her research was on women only. So the majority of women that end up in these relationships with someone with a personality disorder actually do not have traits of codependency, nor do they come from significant trauma backgrounds. And instead, what she found was that they have two personality traits in particular that make them vulnerable. And those traits are agreeableness and conscientiousness. And I'm sure that, a lot of people don't know a lot about personality from a clinical perspective, but the reason this is important to know the difference is because personality is kind of like who we be. It's something that doesn't really change. It's very pervasive, very persistent throughout our lives. And we're born, well, I'll say that we're hardwired with our personality traits. So with codependency tends to come from growing up in a dysfunctional family or having trauma where you learn that you can't have boundaries, your self-esteem or self-worth is low. And the difference between the two is that, if you're going to a therapist and you're trying to work on your codependent traits to figure out why you keep attracting these partners, but you actually are not codependent, but it's your personality traits, you can't heal away your personality, but you can do healing on trauma and codependency. So you may find yourself, and this was my story, you might find yourself trapped again and again in these relationships because you keep thinking, oh, I just got to work on my codependency, but it's actually the personality that needs to be addressed. And with personality traits, we can manage them and have awareness of them, but we don't really make them go away. So I want to say a little bit more about those two traits because it's really important for people to know this. So agreeableness is the trait that we like to think of as is the trait that gets you involved with these relationships in the first place. And somebody who tends to be more agreeable is usually very flexible and easygoing, and they are very forgiving. So, if you're with a narcissist or a toxic partner and they're showing these horrible behaviors, an agreeable person is going to forgive it. They're going to say, oh, I'm going to give you a second chance and a third chance and a 10th chance, and they they tend to kind of have a lot of empathy and compassion for somebody, and can see, a lot of people see kind of that wounded side of a narcissist and feel bad for them. The other trait, conscientiousness, is the trait that keeps you in the relationship, because people who are conscientious tend to be very loyal. They have a lot of integrity and very dependable. So what they will do is they have these strong ideas about relationship. They're like the ones that are going to want to do therapy. They're not going to just throw in the towel because they're having a hard time. They're going to try to see it through. And so when you're trying to do that and you're with a narcissist who is likely not going to get any better, you can stay in these relationships for a really long time.
Okay. So when I was younger, probably 19 or something, very young, many, many years ago, whatever, I dated a narcissist for 3 years.
Mm.
And I remember like thinking back, I thought maybe it was because I was codependent. But now that you say this, I'm thinking I was very agreeable
Yes.
and probably like very high in conscientiousness. Like one of those people that it's like when I make a commitment, like that's it. Like I'm never late to anything. I'm just
Yes.
like, you have to have respect. You don't cheat. You don't lie. You don't do anything.
Totally.
You don't like, cut someone in line. Like I go crazy if someone does that. Like I'm very like strict with those
Yes.
things. So that's why I was like, trying to work on things. But then I'm thinking like, how did I switch that off? And that's because the only thing I was not able to help the conscientious part. That stuff seemed hardwired on me.
Mm-hmm.
But I was able to help the agreeable stuff and just not be agreeable to the point where I will meet a narcissist, someone that I know is a narcissist, and they are completely disgusted by me. And I'm like, yes, I'm doing something great. They're just like, ugh.
Yay. Boundaries, someone with boundaries.
Yes, and I noticed like people who are narcissistic, they used to love me. Now they
Mm-hmm.
absolutely hate me. Like they have like a visceral reaction to me and they want to get their spouse or their girlfriend the hell away from me because they don't want them to catch it.
Totally. Yes. Yeah, I mean, that's a great example of what can happen. And I think it's, you know, if you have those traits, it is something like learning how to set boundaries, learning how to not tolerate that kind of behavior. You can have a big heart and you can also have boundaries. But what happens is if you're really agreeable, you have a big heart and then you're really loose on your boundaries.
Yes, and I do notice that with friendships, it's also great to not be agreeable. Like,
Yeah.
oh, I don't want to do that. And then they're like, you have to because of this and blah, blah, blah. And I'm just like, why would I do something I don't want to do? And no is a complete sentence. And then they get really angry. And that also can help you end toxic friendships and a whole bunch of stuff in your
Yeah.
life gets really, really great when you just
Yes.
have very strict boundaries.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. And I think people can get confused about codependency and these traits. And some people have both. I mean, that was me. Like, I had codependency early in my life because I grew up in a dysfunctional family with a narcissist. And yet I did a lot of healing on that, a lot of trauma work on that, but the agreeableness didn't go away. And I wasn't really aware that that was the part that kept getting me stuck in these kinds of relationships. So it's good for people to understand, if you've had that history of abuse or dysfunctional relationships, then you probably need to look at, some of these traits from codependency. And then also, do I have these personality traits? And you can also go online and do a personality quiz to find out what I think it's like the big 5 personality traits or something like that. But you can see what you're high on as far as the top 5 personality traits.
Mm. Yes. And when I redid that test, I went from super high and agreeable to super low.
That's good. Good for you.
But happiness went from super low to super high.
Yeah. Yeah. That makes so much sense. Yeah.
So, what are some maybe red flags early on in a relationship that you can dismiss or ignore? Like, okay, for me, an example, when I first got with the narcissistic person, in the beginning, they just wanted to talk to me all the time. Oh, you're so wonderful. Like, I have to talk to you like every minute, like while I'm at work, while I'm driving home
Mhm.
from work. I asked him, I'm like, isn't this gonna get annoying later? Are you gonna like, are you okay with this? Because like I didn't have anything going on because when he was calling me, I was like between classes or whatever, so I could talk. So I'm just like, are you sure this isn't too much? Like, distance makes the heart grow fonder. This is a little bit much. And he's like, no, I could never get bored of talking to you. And then months later, it was like, I have to talk to you every time I get out of work. You're so needy and all this stuff. And I'm just like,
Yeah.
what? What?
Oh, yep. Yeah, that is a red flag right there. And what happens is in the beginning, they engage in what we call love bombing. And that is where there's, a lot of praise and affection, and they constantly want to be with you, constantly want to talk to you. I mean, I had a very similar experience where mine just was like, I would get out of a therapy session. He would call me literally on the dot. He knew when my therapy session would end. I had 10 minutes because I'm a therapist. So I had 10 minutes in between sessions to like do a lot of things. And he would demand that time. And at first I was like, oh, it's so nice to have somebody who just wants to be in contact all the time. And then it got really exhausting. So yeah, the constant contact, definitely when they want to move fast in the relationship. And, there's a lot of different degrees of that. Some are really like, seriously fast. Like in 2 weeks, they're proposing marriage to you or they want to move in. And or it might be a few months. But the thing to think of is like, what might be happening is they're like, oh my god, you are my soulmate, and you're spending all this time together. And in the beginning, first of all, you've got all these feel good chemicals going on when you first meet somebody, whether they're a narcissist or it's just a normal healthy partner. And so you've got oxytocin and dopamine that's making you feel totally high on this relationship, and you're like, yeah, this is it, right? And the other thing that they are really good at, and this is what gets so confusing for people, that they do something called mirroring. And what mirroring is that they are masters at watching everything about you. They notice your gestures. They notice your mannerisms, your language. They pick up on the things that you're interested in. They listen to the story about Aunt Judy and Uncle Bob. They pick up on all of it and then they mirror it back to you. And so you might talk about how you're this super spiritual person. You go to yoga all the time. You do all this stuff. And they're like, oh, yeah, I go to yoga all the time. And I'm so into this book and this. And then later on down the road, when you start taking them to yoga classes, you're like, I don't think he actually has ever been to a yoga class. He doesn't even know what downward dog is. And you start to notice that maybe there's some discrepancies there. But in the beginning, that is like very hot and heavy. And what happens is we think, oh my God, I've met my soulmate. This person is perfect. We have everything in common. And so it can be really deceiving when you're experiencing that and hard to know, like, did I meet my perfect match or am I dating a narcissist? And this is why I tell people the most important thing you can do is to take it slow. Do not move in with somebody. Do not get married. Give it at least a year before you make big commitments like that. Because even after a year, they can hold it together. But the reason I wrote my book, and I wrote it with the title of Insight is 2020, playing off of that idea of hindsight is 2020. And the reason I kind of took that angle is because we usually can, come after a relationship and have that hindsight is 2020 moment where we're like, oh my gosh, I saw it from the beginning. And it might not have been clear then, but then in retrospect, we can go back and we can look and say, all the red flags were there. Why didn't I listen to myself? Why didn't I trust it? Right. And so that's why it's important to give yourself that time so that you're seeing, if there are red flags, you're building up, kind of a lot of evidence of the red flags versus I see one red flag, I blow it off, and then we're moving in together 3 weeks later and you're thinking everything's okay. And then you have 100 more red flags that show up after that. Right.
Mm. So there was another guy, which probably was a narcissist as well, but I didn't stay with him that long to like really know for sure, but probably. Immediately when we got together, he wanted to get married and like lock me down immediately. And I'm like, I need to get to know you first.
Mm-hmm.
This is a little weird. And it's like, whatever you like, let's do that. And yeah, anything you want. You want me to buy you a car? You want me to buy you this? And I'm just like, whoa, whoa, whoa. Like, if it sounds too good to be true, it always is in my mind. That's what I always kept telling myself. And I remember one time he cheated on me and then he told me about it to try to get a reaction from me. And then I just
Mm.
had the complete best reaction. I'm like, oh, I really liked you, but since you did that, that's against my moral values. So I can't be with someone like that. And, it's been great getting to know you and I wish you the best. And he freaked out and he's like, no, this isn't how it's supposed to go. You're supposed to try harder and want to be with me immediately because you're jealous and everything. And I'm
Oh,
like, no,
wow.
I already went through that before. So I already know how this goes.
Good for you. I wish we could all react like that. That was really good.
I know. So, and I try to tell my friends to do this too, and they are shocked how like much it works. And then the guy is just chasing them for decades after that. It's so
Yeah.
weird. But anyways, so let's see. Tell me about the 4 F's of trauma.
Okay. So I talk about the 4 F's of trauma because what I like to help people look at is that there are external red flags and internal red flags in these relationships. And the external red flags are a lot of what we've talked about. They're the dynamics in the relationship, like gaslighting or turning things back on you. And then, just looking at the personality characteristics of the narcissist himself or herself. But then the internal red flags are even more important to pay attention to. And that's where we have to listen to our body. And, a lot of times we always say, listen to your gut, trust your gut. Why aren't you trusting your gut? And what happens in these relationships is that we start to become traumatized. We start to have trauma responses. And when we are in a trauma state or a trauma response, we cannot trust our gut because our gut is like totally, it's like the trauma itself is just drowning out whatever gut responses are there. So, going back to your question of what are the 4 F's of trauma, I take that title from a therapist and author named Pete Walker. He wrote the book Complex Post-Traumatic Stress Disorder. And so he really talked about the 4 F's. And most people have heard of fight or flight and we know what that means. But really, there's 4 different trauma responses: fight, flight, freeze, and fawn. And fight, so let me just say, in general, for people who don't really understand, the mechanisms of a trauma responses happen as a means of survival. And it is when, I always like to use the metaphor of like, back when we were cave people, you're walking through the forest and a bear comes in the woods. And in that moment, you are not going to stop and have a moment and think, I wonder what the best plan of action is right now. Like, we're not going to engage our rational brain, or we might get killed if we stand there and think too long. What happens is our amygdala is a part of our brain and it snaps into action immediately, and it makes a decision for us based on what it thinks is going to help us survive in that moment. It is completely unconscious. We do not have control over it. So if it thinks that running, which would be flight, is the best plan of action to get you away from that bear, you're going to run in that moment. If it means fight, you might stand up and wave your arms and growl at the bear if you've been taught that's what you do to a brown bear or something. I don't know. That would be a fight response. Fawning is like you've heard the saying "a deer in the headlights." It comes from that kind of idea of like fawning is where, well, I'm sorry, freezing is a deer in the headlights where we just freeze. You run into, you see the bear and all of a sudden you're like, the best plan is just to not do anything. Maybe he won't notice me. And then fawning is a relatively new term. And that's where it's, basically extreme people pleasing. And so when people are in a relationship with a narcissist, and especially if you have not had prior trauma, over time, as the psychological and emotional abuse or physical abuse starts to happen more frequently, you're going to find that you're experiencing these kinds of trauma responses. And so, one of the things is important, that I think is important for people to do is to educate themselves about that and to know what those feel like in the body or know what those look like in behaviors. So fighting is if I'm constantly screaming and yelling and fighting back with my partner, getting really aggressive. Flight would be being really busy all the time, never feeling like you can sit down and rest, always on edge. And freeze would be like you're dissociating, you're checking out, you're frozen when he comes home from work. You stand there and you just are like, I feel like a zombie. I can't even function right now. And fawning, which is actually one that I see the most in these relationships, fawning is where you're constantly trying to please them. You're walking on eggshells. You're always saying you're sorry. You're bending over backwards to make them happy or try to make them happy. And so if you're engaging in one or any of those, that is a gigantic red flag. I don't care if you think this person's a narcissist or not. That is something that you don't want to have to be doing in your relationship. So those are the 4 trauma responses that are important for people to know about in these relationships.
So, my background is in psychology, and I had to work with a lot of narcissists slash psychopaths slash past violent offenders. And
Yes.
one thing I noticed was whenever they would be around me, and like, let's say they had called me and I was out with another patient or whatever, because I would do home visits and they needed something, and they would get very angry and they would show up to my office. And this is like a huge man and I'm a very tiny petite female, and they're angry as hell. So I would do the fawning stuff. I'm like, you're like my favorite client, right? You know that I would do
Yeah.
anything for you and you're so wonderful. And it's not me, it's these my bosses.
Totally.
They're just doing all this stuff that like I had to do all these extra work. I don't want to do that. I'd want to immediately answer your call, and then they would just calm down and they're little puppy dogs again. But I
Yes.
mean, you have to play them.
Yes. Yes, I can relate. I used to work with a very similar population early in my career, and I did a lot of the same because even though you're professional, even you're still having that response because it is unconscious and it's trying to keep you safe. So that's a really great example.
Yes, and I have had other coworkers that got punched in the face. So you are still
Yeah.
alone with a large man, so you have to
Yes.
kind of appease them and then get them back.
Yes, totally. Yeah.
So let's see. Hold on for 1 second. Let me try to find a good. Oh, okay. So what is the reason that you feel that people who are in narcissistic relationships, maybe getting physically and or emotionally abused, why do they have such a hard time leaving?
Yeah, such a good question. So, I think a lot of us can relate to that feeling of having that friend that is in the worst relationship and they call you all the time and they're complaining about it, or you see what a jerk their partner is and you're like, why do they stay? I don't understand. And, when if somebody is being abused by a narcissist or a sociopath, they usually form what we call a trauma bond. And a trauma bond is something that occurs when, there's a lot of factors that go into play, but some of it is that there's a cycle of abuse that occurs in these relationships where the narcissist, we'll just say the narcissist for simplicity's sake, the narcissist does something abusive and hurts the partner. And then afterwards may apologize profusely, I'll never do it again. I'm going to get better. And then things continue. And, for a minute, that partner is like, okay, I believe you, or I want to believe you. And then things are okay for a minute. And then, that could go on for minutes. It could go on for hours, days, it could even go on for months. And then another explosion happens. And so there's this kind of cycle of them making everything okay. Like we like to, in domestic violence terms, we call this the cycle of abuse. And it's like there's tension building where it's coming, and then there's the explosion, and then there's what we call the hearts and flowers phase, and then it starts all over again. And that cycle can be really almost addictive in a sense, but it's deceptive. It what happens to the victim is that they develop what's called cognitive dissonance. And what happens with cognitive dissonance is where we are holding two opposing truths or beliefs in our mind at the same time, and they're opposite to each other. So it's like it creates this internal anxiety. A good example that has nothing to do with narcissistic abuse is I smoke, but I know smoking causes cancer. And in order for me to continue smoking, I have to deny this knowledge over here about cancer. So people get into a lot of cognitive dissonance who smoke or, do things like that. So that's a kind of a clear example. With narcissistic abuse, what happens with cognitive dissonance is you see the Jekyll and Hyde personality. One minute they're nice, the next minute they're horrible. And so that creates cognitive dissonance about your partner. I love him, I fear him. He's my soulmate, he's my terrorist. And it's very confusing. And what happens is if a person is experiencing cognitive dissonance in a relationship like that, that in and of itself is a trauma symptom of these kinds of relationships. It's indicative of narcissistic abuse or, a toxic relationship. So what happens is you are latching on to one of those beliefs. No, I love him right now. That's going to keep you stuck in that trauma bond. He's going to get better, yet I never see him getting better, right? So you have these moments of clarity of like, no, this is not good, but then it's the positive times, it's the loving times that can keep you really stuck in that trauma bond.
I'm thinking back to my first narcissistic relationship, and I remember him because my thing was not like the second one that wanted to get married immediately. It was kind of the opposite, because he knew I wanted to get married and have a family and all that stuff. So he would kind of hold that over my head, like, oh, I can't marry you because you don't make six figures yet. And I'm in school, I'm like 19 or something. Like, what do you expect?
Right.
And then he'd be like, oh, well, because, you don't have a really good family. So like, I don't know if it's worth it to me to be, and like all these things, like picking at all the things that like were my sensitive spots.
Right.
And like over and over and over. And then finally I remember, like, I'm trying to wonder, like, what is the catalyst that finally makes you break out of that?
Mm-hmm.
And for me, it was just like, anytime anyone mentioned weddings or marriage, he would shut down visibly and like look away. Like, I can't even be a part of this conversation. And then one time I saw him do that, and in front of like 20 people of my friends, my closest friends, I just got up and I just cursed him out. And I'm like, get the hell away from me. And I'm just sick and tired of this. And I went off on him. I said the meanest, horriblest things. And I'm like, and get out. Bye. And it was like so terrible. But I mean, after 3 years, like it finally bubbled up, and then I saw his face and I saw that this kept happening over, and I'm like, what, am I an idiot? So what is it that finally breaks women, especially, of this, where they finally go, this is enough? Like, is there like a commonality?
No. Sadly, I have seen so many straws that broke the camel's back, in my career. And I think it's different for everybody. And, I've worked with women who've been with narcissists for decades, and they are broken down. And the longer that you're with one, and the more extensive the abuse is, the harder it is to leave. And there's also other factors, especially for women, and this can happen for men too. But you might have kids, and you're afraid to leave because then you're going to have to share custody or lose custody, or they have taken all the money and all of the financial control. Maybe you were a stay-at-home mom because they encouraged you to stay home and never work, and then 20 years later you have no career, no way to make money. Or there's also a lot of cultural or religious things that happen depending on your beliefs or the culture you live in around getting a divorce or leaving a partner. So there's a lot of different reasons that make it hard for somebody to leave. And there's also just the impact of not only the cognitive dissonance that occurs, but the psychological abuse is so intense. When you start to lose a sense of yourself, you believe that you're worthless, you believe that nobody else will love you. He's the best there is. I'm not worthy. Something's wrong with me. I'm crazy. I'm horrible. All those horrible things that you've been told throughout this relationship make you feel so small that you're terrified to go out there. So I know I had experienced that. And I see this so often. Women just lose they become so disconnected with their truth. And it's so sad.
Is there any way for, like, let's say a friend or a family member to help nudge along someone who's in a narcissistic relationship
Mm-hmm.
to realize
Yes.
it?
Yeah, I think people have to be really cautious when, like, if you suspect or know that your friend or family member is with a narcissist or an abusive partner, there's a lot of dynamics that can happen. Like, you might start to notice that they're isolating more because the narcissist might not let them be having contact with friends or family or be telling them negative messages about them. So don't let them slip away. Even if you have to say, hey, is there a secret way we can meet up at a gym class? Or, don't just let them fly under the radar and disappear and think that it's like they don't like you anymore. It might, it very well could be that the partner's isolating them. The other thing I think people have to be really careful of is not to be too judgy or should on your friend. And what I mean by that is you are not in their shoes. And unless you've been in a relationship like this, I promise you probably do not get even half of it and how destructive and difficult it is. So be careful with saying, well, you should just leave, or you should do this. I think it's important to have a lot of empathy and compassion for them and to let them know that no matter what, I'm here for you. But I think it's also important, so that's kind of like this one side of it of don't be too pushy. But then there's another side where I think as women, sometimes we get afraid to tell our friends, hey, I think your partner's a jerk. Like there's a group of friends and everybody talks about what a jerk this person is, but nobody tells the girlfriend, right? And I just say we have to have each other's backs. We have to protect each other as women. And if you have a friend or a family member that you think something's going on or you suspect her partner's cheating or something, don't keep that a secret. There's nothing worse than like 5 years later, you break up with the person and your friends are like, God, we saw it all along. And you're like, well, why didn't you say something? Because that woman needs to be validated. Let her know, I see what he does to you. That's not healthy. Here's a book on narcissistic abuse. So don't be too pushy, but also don't be too silent either. There's a happy middle there.
So let's say we have a daughter. How can we, like maybe from childhood or when they're going through adolescence, how can we kind of bulletproof them against being the victim of a narcissist one day?
Such a great question. Well, here's a big one. If you're with a narcissistic father or mother, don't continue the relationship with them so that your children have to continue to be abused, because this can definitely be generational. So leave. bottom line, if you were with somebody that your kids are being exposed to that. As far as teaching her, I think teaching girls to have boundaries, helping girls learn that they don't have to be nice to everybody. We get, the gender stereotypes and gender roles are extreme. And even if we're like these super feminist, strong woman kind of, people, like we're still living in a culture that unfortunately in this day and age, we still get those messages. Be nice, don't be an angry woman, So help her know that it's okay to not be nice to everybody. Help her understand what boundaries are. And very importantly, help her listen to her gut. I'm always teaching my kids, like, did you notice what that felt like when that happened? Or if I'm like around somebody that kind of creeps me out, I will share that experience and I'm like, oh, I can just feel that in my body. Do you notice that in your body? And so that's always a conversation that we're having. And I think it starts out as young as possible, and you can be age appropriate. The other thing that maybe it's because I'm a therapist and I've had these experiences, but I also have taught my adolescent daughters what to look for. What does a narcissist look like? These are the kinds of things to look out for. So it's okay to educate your kids about these things, but there's, you got to be age appropriate, but those are some really important aspects of it, I think.
And okay, I have like a weird one because I have half of my friends say this is totally wrong, and the other half are like, that kind of makes sense. I like that. Okay, so this is what I do. When I was growing up, I had a big thing about like sharing. I did not like to be forced to share with especially strangers, and that seemed weird to me. Like they have to become your friends first. You have to trust them, because how many times did you lend a toy or was forced to lend a toy and then the kid broke it just to see your expression? And I always remembered that when I was a child. So when I had my daughter, I was like, look, you don't have to lend anyone anything unless you trust them.
Yeah.
And the other parents would be like, you're teaching her to be spoiled.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, I could totally see where you're coming from on that. I think I could see where people could be in both camps on that. But I agree. I think we take away kids' power. There's kind of a line of teaching children to be pro-social, where we can be nice people and nice kids to each other, but also letting them have a sense of boundaries and power over their choices. And we take a lot of their power away by forcing a lot of choices. And some of that is parenting, like we have to set limits with our kids, but I think there's a way, I like that. Just do it when you trust that person, that child. I think that's it, is teaching a kid how to trust themselves and trust their decisions. And you do that by giving them the opportunity to make mistakes, and you give them boundaries as well. You don't just let them go out and figure life out on their own. They have to have, a corral to be able to run around crazy in and make boundaries, but they know where they can stop and start.
Yeah, and I'm just thinking, like, when you're an adult, if someone goes, let me borrow your car, and you don't know them, you're not going to let them borrow your
Yeah.
car. I mean, you don't know, like, if they're drunk or whatever. You don't know anything about this person. You don't know if you can trust them. You don't just, especially if it's something you like. And I see a lot of kids that are kind of leaning towards like kind of being bullies, that the main thing they go for is, oh, you love that toy, let me have it, and then they break it just to see your expression.
Yeah. 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 We could probably have a whole other conversation about that. But yeah, I think helping kids feel empowered and to be able to set boundaries. And I think this also goes along the lines of like teaching kids about body safety too. Like, we're always like, go give Grandpa Joe a hug or go sit on Santa's lap. And that is not okay either. The kids like saying, no, I don't want to. And you're making them kiss them or hug them. And that is not a safe practice. You need to let kids be in control of their bodies.
Yes, 100%. I'm all for that. And I remember as a kid, I'm like, no, I'm not doing that. I don't want to touch somebody. That's creepy. And they're like,
Yeah.
you're rude if you don't. And I'm like, well, then I'm the rudest kid ever.
Right.
And that was fine with me. But So when it comes to narcissistic relationship, let's say friendships, are there any different signs that you need to look for?
It's the same. It can be the same. I mean, your friend may not be saying, let's move in together and get married, obviously, but, you know, one of the things that, here's another dynamic that might be helpful. One of the dynamics that narcissists do is called idealize, devalue, and discard. And what happens is in the idealization phase, they see you as perfect. They see you as this amazing person. And so let's look at it as a friend. Your friend might, like, you feel the same thing, like in the love bombing, like, oh my God, we're besties. Like, this friend is just saying all these great things. They want to be together with you all the time, and things might seem really great. And then what happens in the narcissist mind is they start to see your flaws. And instead of being able to see gray like the rest of us, they see things in a very black and white way. And so as soon as they see the flaws, they start to devalue you. And they might do that in their minds as a friend, but you might start to notice some comments. They make some passive aggressive comments about you, or they start to not want to hang out with you anymore, or, you might feel a lot of jealousy and insecurity. That's often what I see play out, especially with female friendships with narcissists. And then all of a sudden you get the discard. And the discard is where your friend all of a sudden completely blows you off. Maybe you're never, I had a narcissist friend that did this to me, and I knew she was a narcissist. In the beginning, I didn't, but once I started to see the signs, I knew. And I don't even know what happened, but she finally discarded me. I was actually relieved because I couldn't tolerate being her friend anymore, but I was being too agreeable and conscientious to say, I'm done with you. But all of a sudden, one day she said, I can't be friends with you anymore. I'm done. And I'm like, why? She couldn't even give me a reason. And, that happens with dating too, where the ghosting happens. Or I've had clients who've been married for 20 years and their husband completely just leaves the entire family and no explanation, and just completely abandons them. So that's a cycle that you can pay attention to. But as far as just narcissistic friends, pay attention to the personality stuff again, the superiority, the entitlement. Maybe they're lacking empathy or compassion for you. They might need a lot of admiration, or they're really sensitive to criticism. So, beware if that's what's going on with a friend.
I noticed that a lot of female friendships, there's a lot of these tendencies in them, especially when you're younger. Do you feel that that's just something that females do to each other when they're younger more prevalently than men? And I don't believe that those same females are also narcissistic when it comes to their relationships. I feel like they might be on the opposite end of the spectrum. So have you noticed that?
Well, are you talking about like teenagers or yeah? I think that as teens we go through a phase where we are very egocentric. And that starts really in early childhood and goes throughout adolescence. And self-centered, egocentric behavior, plus we're trying to figure out who we are. So there's a lot of insecurity, a lot of jealousy. And girls are, unfortunately, we are taught to compete with each other. We are not taught to love each other and support each other and hold each other up. And it starts there. So I think you see a lot of that behavior coupled with not great abilities to regulate their emotions yet, or not a good, strong sense of self. And then they have that egocentric, self centered kind of thing. It can look a little narcissistic. And certainly there might be some that turn out to be narcissists later on. But some of that is very normal teenage behavior too. And it's so hard. It's heartbreaking to see
Yes.
girls go through that.
Yes. I've seen with my daughter. She's very young. She's not a teenager yet, maybe 9 or so. Every time she gets a best friend, they get very clingy in the beginning. You're my best friend. You're everything. I love you, blah, blah, blah. They want to see each other all the time, always on the phone. And then there's always this switch where it's like, you're short, and you're this, and you're that, and nobody really likes you. Like the other friend just like switches on her, and I'm just like, wow, this is weird.
Yeah.
They're all like kind of doing this.
Yes. Yeah, I know both of my daughters have gone through that too. It's so painful to watch, and but it's super common. I mean, I all of my friends that have daughters have had this experience.
Yes. And is there anything that maybe you have told your daughters, like when a friend kind of becomes a little bit toxic to them, how they should respond to set boundaries?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I really encourage them to find other friends, because what will happen is they will want to continue to try to be with that friend, and then they just keep getting hurt. So, I try to help them understand, like, okay, is this behavior hurting you? What kinds of things are happening here? And some of it, I think, is coaching them to be able to talk and use their feelings, express their feelings, set boundaries, use their voice to share with this friend what's happening. But if that isn't working and they keep getting hurt, then it's time to find another friend. There again, like, you could teach them young, don't stay with a toxic person. That is not good behavior. We have to protect ourselves.
Yes. Is there anything, do you feel like modeling good behavior with friends and boundaries can also help them absorb that?
Oh, absolutely. So important. We have to be good role models for our kids.
I remember going through my daughter's text messages, and they're so cute. They're so tiny and they're already text messaging each other. It's adorable. And just seeing one of them says something mean to her. And then she's like, okay, well, just so you know, because you said that, I'm not going to hang out with you this weekend. And then she's like, why? Why would you do that? And it's like, well, because, if you don't treat me nice, why would I want to hang out with you? And then and it's like, oh, I'm
That's
so
good.
proud.
Yes, very good. Good job, Mama.
Tell me a little bit about your book and who you feel should really get this book.
Yeah. So the book is Insight is 2020: How to Trust Yourself to Protect Yourself from Narcissistic Abuse and Toxic Relationships. And it is all about looking at external and internal red flags, kind of like we were talking about earlier. And, so I focus on how to identify personality disorders. What are some of those external red flags to look for in a person to see if they're narcissistic or psychopath or sociopath? But then the extent of the book is all about those internal red flags, where I talk about trauma, and I also go into attachment. So if anybody here that's listening knows anything about attachment styles, I know a lot of people are into that these days. So I talk about how your attachment style can interact with a toxic partner. I also talk a lot about health and how our body will react when we're undergoing a lot of stress or trauma. And it's common for people in these toxic relationships over time to start to develop chronic diseases, autoimmune disease, weight gain, IBS, things like that. So I talk a lot about what happens emotionally and physically and spiritually that indicates we are in trouble in our relationship. And then I also help people understand, well, I give people some techniques to be able to listen to themselves better so that they can trust themselves and exit a relationship if they're in one like this.
That's great. Because I have noticed people who are in these type of relationships, I'll see them develop things like MS or like digestive
Yes.
issues, a whole bunch of autoimmune stuff.
Yes.
And then I always tell them, just leave the relationship. You'll see. And then maybe 10 years later, when they finally leave it, it dissolves, it goes away. And one of the reasons that they were staying in, then maybe they need insurance, or who's going to take care of me while I'm sick. And that just leads them more
Yes.
deeper.
Totally. Yes. With all the work you do on health as well, for sure. It is definitely a thing.
Do you also see patients online and have a practice going?
Yeah, so I have a private practice where I do therapy with clients in Colorado, but I also have a coaching practice with an online coaching program for where women can do. It's like an 8-week program where we work on toxic relationship recovery or helping people leave them. And then I also have a Facebook group called the Toxic Relationship Recovery Community. There's lots of different ways to work with me and help free yourself of these toxic relationship patterns.
Okay, awesome. And where else can people find you online? Are you on any social media platforms?
Yeah, they can look for me on Instagram or Facebook. It's Chelli Pumphrey, and my name is spelled Chelli Pumphrey. So sometimes people look for the Shelley with the S, but no, I'm the Shelley with the C.
Awesome. So I'm going to put all of that in the show notes. But is there anything else you'd like to share with the audience before we go?
One thing that I love to tell people, just as a parting message, is my mantra of you always know. And part of why I wrote that book is to help people know that the red flags are always there. We just have to become better educated and more in tune with ourselves and trust the signals that we're getting, because most of the time we're getting the signals, but we just don't interpret them correctly, or we dismiss them or miss them altogether. That's just something that I'd like everybody to know. You always know.
Again, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much, Kat. It was really fun to talk to you.